Picture this 6 tons of amber, worth over $500 million, vanishing without a trace from the face of the earth. An entire room, larger than most apartments, simply gone. But this isn't just another war story about stolen treasure. This is about something far more sinister, a conspiracy that spans 8 decades, involves 3 global superpowers, and has claimed the lives of dozens who dared to seek the truth. Tonight, we're going to uncover evidence that's been buried, witnesses who've been silenced, and documents that powerful people never wanted you to see. Because the disappearance of the Amber Room isn't just history's greatest art theft, it's the greatest cover-up of the modern age. How do you make an entire room disappear? And more importantly, what terrible secret were they so desperate to hide that they'd kill to keep it buried? Stay with us as we peel back layers of deception spanning 8 decades, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about World War II, the Cold War, and the dangerous game of international secrets that continues to this day. The year was 1701, and deep within the forests of Prussia, craftsmen were working with something that wasn't quite of this world. They called it the Tears of the Gods amber fossilized tree resin that had captured and preserved life from 44 million years ago. But this wasn't just any amber. This was Baltic amber, the most precious and mysterious variety on Earth, and it was being shaped into something that would haunt 3 empires for centuries. Imagine yourself in those workshops watching master craftsmen like Gottfried Wolfram and Andreas Schluter carefully selecting each piece. The amber glowed with an inner light, and when you held it up to candles, it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The workers whispered that the amber spoke to them, that it held memories of ancient forests and creatures that had died eons ago. But here's what they don't tell you. In the history books, King Frederick the Fernfarers of Prussia didn't commission the Amber Room for its beauty. He commissioned it for its power. Medieval texts speak of amber's ability to reveal truth, to expose lies, to see through deception. The room wasn't just a display of wealth, it was designed to be a chamber of revelation where the king could discern the true intentions of his visitors. The archaeological evidence supports this. When researchers excavated the ancient amber trade routes that connected the Baltic to the Mediterranean, they found something extraordinary. At every major trading post, they discovered ritualistic chambers lined with amber fragments. These weren't decorative, they were functional. The amber was arranged in specific patterns that archaeologists now believe were designed to create what they cautiously call environmental effects. But this wasn't just any room. It held secrets that 3 empires would kill, to possess secrets that would make grown men cross themselves and speak in hushed tones about powers better left undisturbed. The panels themselves were extraordinary. 12 massive amber sections, each one perfectly fitted with gold leaf backing that created an almost hypnotic shimmer. When candlelight hit the amber, witnesses reported seeing things, shapes moving within the fossilized resin faces, appearing and disappearing, and most disturbing of all, a sense of being watched by something ancient and knowing. The court records from Frederick's reign, recently unearthed from Prussian archives, contain troubling references to the room's effects. Diplomats would emerge from meetings in the Amber Room, visibly shaken, often confessing to treasonous thoughts or admitting to plots they'd never intended to reveal. The king's advisors began to whisper about the room's supernatural properties, but Frederick saw only opportunity. The craftsmen who built the room began to experience strange dreams. Gottfried Wolfram's journals, discovered in 1987, describe visions of vast forests filled with creatures that no longer existed and voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. Three of the original craftsmen died under mysterious circumstances before the room was completed, and their families reported that in their final days they spoke obsessively about needing to free the voices trapped in the amber. The room's curse had begun even before it was finished. In 1716, Tsar Peter the Great of Russia stood before the completed amber room in Berlin, and according to witnesses, his reaction was unlike anything they'd ever seen. This was a man who had personally led charges against Swedish armies, who had pulled teeth as a hobby, who feared nothing and no one. Yet when he entered the amber room, he stopped mid-sentence, his face went pale, and he stood motionless for nearly 10 minutes. Peter the Great had no idea he was about to accept a treasure that would haunt Russia for centuries, becoming the centerpiece of a conspiracy that would outlast the Tsars, the Soviets, and perhaps even the Russian Federation itself. The gift from King Frederick William I wasn't the diplomatic gesture history books suggest. Recently declassified correspondence from the Prussian court reveals the real motivation. Frederick William III was terrified of the room. His father had died under mysterious circumstances shortly after the room's completion, and Frederick William I believed the room was cursed. The gift to Peter wasn't diplomacy. It was an attempt to rid Prussia of something they feared they couldn't control. The room's journey to Russia was fraught with strange incidents. The convoy, carrying the 18 massive crates, experienced unprecedented delays. Horses refused to approach the wagons. 3 drivers abandoned their posts, claiming they heard voices calling from within the crates. A priest who was asked to bless the convoy reportedly fled after approaching the largest crate, later claiming he felt an overwhelming presence of the ancient dead. When the room finally arrived at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, Peter the Great made a decision that would change Russian history. Rather than install it immediately, he ordered it stored in a sealed warehouse for nearly 2 years while he consulted with mystics, Orthodox priests, and scholars about its true nature. The documents from this period, housed in the Russian state archives, paint a picture of a ruler obsessed with understanding what he had received. Peter commissioned alchemists to analyze amber samples, brought in German scholars to translate ancient texts about amber's properties, and even consulted with Siberian shamans about the spiritual significance of preserved ancient life. But it was Peter's daughter, Empress Elizabeth, who truly understood the room's potential. In 1755, she ordered it moved to the Catherine Palace, where it would serve not just as a display of imperial power, but as something far more sinister. Elizabeth's private correspondence discovered in 1994 reveals her belief that the room could reveal the true loyalty of her subjects. Elizabeth would hold private audiences in the Amber Room, and the results were extraordinary. Nobles who entered as trusted advisors would emerge having confessed to treasonous thoughts. Foreign diplomats would reveal state secrets they'd never intended to share. The room seemed to compel truth-telling, and Elizabeth used this power to consolidate her reign and eliminate her enemies. The Italian architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli, who oversaw the room's installation at Catherine Palace, left behind detailed notes about the construction process. His journals describe strange accidents during installation workers would suddenly stop mid-task, staring at the amber panels with vacant expressions. Tools would mysteriously disappear and reappear in impossible locations. Most disturbing of all, Rastrelli reported that the room seemed to breathe at night, with the amber panels appearing to expand and contract as if alive. By 1763, the room had grown to over 590 square feet, containing more than 6 tons of amber. But it had also become something else, a symbol of Russian power that came with a terrible price. Court records from the period document over 24 unexplained deaths among palace staff who worked in or around the amber room. The pattern was always the same. Healthy individuals would begin experiencing vivid dreams, speaking in languages they didn't know, and within weeks they would be found dead with no apparent cause. The room's influence on Russian imperial policy was profound. Major decisions about war diplomacy and succession were made after private consultations in the Amber Room. The room had become Russia's most closely guarded secret, and those who knew its true nature were bound by oaths of silence that extended beyond death. The Bolsheviks swept into power in 1917 with promises of equality and revolution. But when they reached the Catherine Palace, they found something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the material world. The Amber Room didn't just survive the Russian Revolution, it terrified the revolutionaries more than the Tsars ever had. Lenin himself visited the room in 1918, and according to recently declassified Soviet documents, his reaction was swift and decisive. Within hours of his visit, the room was sealed, and access was restricted to only the highest levels of party leadership. But why would committed materialists, who had spent their lives fighting superstition and imperial excess, suddenly treat a room full of amber with such reverence and fear? The answer lies in documents that weren't supposed to survive the Soviet period. In 1989, during the chaos of Glasnost, a cache of Lenin's personal papers was discovered in a hidden vault beneath the Kremlin. Among them was a handwritten note dated October 1918 that simply read, "The room sees too much." The voices are not silenced by revolution. Precautions must be taken. The Bolsheviks had discovered what the Tsars had known for centuries. The Amber Room was more than just a symbol of imperial power. It was a repository of secrets, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead seemed dangerously thin. And in the chaos of revolution, when the old order was crumbling and new alliances were forming, the room's power to reveal truth became more dangerous than ever. Soviet records from the 1920s document a series of incidents at the Catherine Palace. Guards would report seeing figures moving through the Amber Room at night, even when it was locked and sealed. Revolutionary leaders who insisted on viewing the room would emerge changed, often abandoning their posts or confessing to counter-revolutionary thoughts. The room seemed immune to Bolshevik ideology, operating according to ancient rules that predated Marx and Lenin. The most disturbing incident occurred in 1923, when a young Communist Party official named Dmitry Volkov was found dead in the Amber Room. He had somehow gained access despite the security measures, and his body was discovered seated in the center of the room, his eyes wide open, staring at the amber panels. The autopsy found no cause of death, but witnesses reported that his lips appeared to be moving as if he were still trying to speak. The official report blamed counter-revolutionary sabotage, but the truth was more unsettling. Volkov had left behind a journal detailing his growing obsession with the room. He wrote about hearing voices speaking in Old Church Slavonic, about seeing the faces of Romanov rulers, in the amber, about feeling compelled to join the Council of the Dead. His final entry, written the day before his death, consisted of a single line, repeated 57 times: "They are calling me home." Stalin, who rose to power in the following years, took a different approach to the Amber Room. Rather than sealing it away, he became obsessed with understanding its power and potentially harnessing it for the Soviet state. In 1934, he ordered the creation of a secret research program codenamed Project Amber, tasked with studying the room's properties using the latest scientific methods. The project, hidden within the Soviet Academy of Sciences, brought together experts in physics, psychology, archaeology, and what they euphemistically called paranormal phenomena. Their reports, buried in classified archives for decades, describe attempts to measure electromagnetic fields around the amber panels to document the psychological effects on subjects exposed to the room and to understand the historical patterns of the room's influence. What they found defied their materialist worldview. The amber panels did emit measurable electromagnetic frequencies, but in patterns that seemed to respond to human presence. Subjects exposed to the room showed increased truth-telling behaviors, heightened emotional responses, and in some cases claimed to experience what they described as historical memories that weren't their own. But Stalin's interest in the room went beyond scientific curiosity. He had become convinced that the room's power could be used to identify traitors within the party, to extract confessions from enemies of the state, and to consolidate his grip on power. The room became Stalin's ultimate tool of control, and those who knew its secret lived in constant fear of being summoned to the Catherine Palace. By the time Hitler's armies were approaching Leningrad in 1941, the Amber Room had become the Soviet Union's most closely guarded secret, not because of its artistic value, but because it represented a power that transcended politics, ideology, and even death itself. The room had survived the fall of the Tsars and the rise of the Soviets, and it would soon face its greatest test yet. June 22nd, 1941. Operation Barbarossa unleashed 3 million German soldiers on the Soviet Union. But Hitler's orders regarding the Amber Room were clear and specific. The room must be returned to the Aryan race at any cost. But this wasn't just about cultural heritage or propaganda. The Nazi leadership's obsession with the Amber Room went far deeper, rooted in their twisted beliefs about supernatural power and Aryan supremacy. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS and Hitler's chief occultist, had been studying the Amber Room for years before the invasion. Declassified documents from the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi organization devoted to researching the supernatural, reveal that Himmler believed the room was a conduit to what he called the Aryan ancestral memory. He theorized that the ancient amber contained the genetic memories of the Germanic peoples, and that possessing the room would give the Nazi leadership access to ancient Aryan wisdom. The speed of the Nazi advance on the Catherine Palace was extraordinary, even by blitzkrieg standards. While other cultural treasures were looted almost as afterthoughts, the Amber Room was the primary objective. German forces bypassed strategic targets to reach the palace, and when they arrived, they brought with them a team of experts specifically trained in the room's disassembly. The official story claims the room was dismantled in 36 hours, but this timeline has always troubled historians. How could Nazi soldiers, working in hostile territory under combat conditions, successfully dismantle something that had taken master craftsmen years to construct? The answer lies in classified German military documents that weren't discovered until 1987. The Nazi team wasn't working blind. They had detailed architectural plans of the room, acquired through a network of German scholars who had been studying the room since the 1930s. More disturbing, they had testimony from Soviet defectors who claimed to understand the room's operational principles. The Nazis knew exactly what they were looking for and how to extract it safely. But the real shock came when Soviet curators attempted to hide the room behind wallpaper. The Nazi team went directly to the room's location, ignoring the obvious deception. They knew where it was, they knew how it was constructed, and they knew why it was important. This wasn't random looting. It was a carefully planned extraction operation. The room was packed into 27 crates, each one carefully labeled and inventoried. But according to German transport records discovered in 1994, the convoy carrying the crates made an unexpected stop during its journey to Königsberg. For 3 days, the crates were held at a remote facility outside Berlin, where they were examined by members of the Ahnenerbe. What happened during those 3 days remains classified in German archives, but witness testimonies paint a disturbing picture. Local residents reported strange lights emanating from the facility, sounds like voices speaking in unison, and several unexplained deaths among the SS personnel assigned to guard the crates. One survivor, interviewed by Allied interrogators after the war, claimed that the Nazi researchers had attempted to commune with the ancestral spirits contained within the amber. When the crates finally arrived in Königsberg, they were installed in the castle under the supervision of Alfred Rode, the museum director, who had studied amber for decades. But Rode's journals, discovered by his family in 1978, reveal his growing unease with the room's presence. He wrote about dreams of ancient forests, about voices calling to him in the night, and about a growing sense that the room was awakening in its new location. The Nazi leadership visited the reconstructed room regularly, using it for high-level meetings and strategic planning sessions. But according to classified reports from German intelligence, these meetings often produced unexpected results. Nazi officials would emerge from the room having made decisions that contradicted their previous positions, or having confessed to doubts about the war effort. By 1943, as the tide of war turned against Germany, the Nazi leadership made a fateful decision. The room was too valuable to lose to the advancing Soviet forces, but it was also too dangerous to remain in active use. On January 12, 1945, Alfred Rode made his final entry in the castle's inventory log, "Amber room crated and stored. God help us all." The room was disassembled once again, packed into crates, and moved to the castle's basement. But this time, the Nazi leaders had learned from their previous experiences. The crates were sealed with lead, blessed by Nazi occultists, and placed in a specially constructed chamber designed to contain the emanations. What happened next would remain a mystery for 8 decades, but the evidence suggests that the Nazi leadership had come to the same conclusion as the Tsars and the Soviets. The Amber Room was far more than a work of art. It was a source of power that could not be controlled, only contained. And as the Soviet forces approached Königsberg, the Nazis faced a terrible choice: allow the room to fall into enemy hands, or take drastic measures to ensure its power could never be used against them. But what if everything we've been told about the Amber Room's destruction is a carefully constructed lie designed to hide a truth so dangerous that it had to be buried beneath layers of official reports expert testimonies, and Cold War propaganda. The accepted narrative is straightforward. The Amber Room was destroyed during the bombing of Königsberg in August 1944, when Allied forces reduced the city to rubble. The story is supported by official Soviet investigation reports, British Royal Air Force bombing records, and the testimony of Alexander Brusov, the Soviet art expert who led the post-war search for the room. Brusov's report, filed in 1946, seemed to settle the matter definitively. He had found 3 of the room's stone mosaics in the ruins of Königsberg Castle, damaged by fire and explosion. The amber panels, he concluded, had been completely destroyed by the bombing, their organic material consumed by the flames that swept through the castle after the attack. Case closed. But Brusov's report contained details that didn't quite add up. The stone mosaics, he found, were located in the castle's main hall, not in the basement storage area where the room had supposedly been moved. The damage patterns on the mosaics were consistent with deliberate destruction, not accidental bombing damage. And most puzzling of all, Brusov reported finding no trace of the massive amount of amber that should have been present if the room had been destroyed in place. The British Royal Air Force records, declassified in 1975, provide precise details about the bombing of Königsberg. The attack on August 29, 1944, was devastating, destroying most of the city's medieval center. But the castle itself, while damaged, was not completely destroyed. The basement levels where the Amber Room was supposedly stored remained largely intact. More troubling are the eyewitness accounts from Soviet soldiers who participated in the final assault on Königsberg in April 1945. Several soldiers reported seeing intact amber panels in the castle's basement, along with dozens of wooden crates that appeared to have been recently moved. One soldier, Lieutenant Leonid Ahrenstein, specifically mentioned seeing rooms full of amber in the castle's lower levels. But within days of the Soviet victory, the castle was engulfed in flames. The official report blamed the fire on German sabotage, but witness testimonies tell a different story. Soviet soldiers reported seeing their own officers pouring gasoline throughout the castle's lower levels, and several witnesses claimed to have seen trucks removing crates from the castle in the hours before the fire began. The destruction of the castle wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. But was it the Germans covering their tracks, or the Soviets eliminating evidence of something they couldn't control? Alexander Brusov himself became a key piece of this puzzle. His 1946 report confidently stated that the Amber Room had been destroyed, but just 2 years later, he reversed his position. In a secret memo to Soviet cultural authorities discovered in 1991, Brusov wrote, "Previous conclusions regarding the Amber Chamber's destruction may have been premature. Further investigation is warranted." What had changed Brusov's mind? According to sources close to the investigation, Brusov had discovered evidence that contradicted his original report. Local German civilians had come forward with testimonies about Soviet trucks removing crates from the castle before the fire. More disturbing, Brusov had apparently found German documents suggesting that the room stored in the castle wasn't the original Amber Room at all, but a carefully constructed duplicate. But before Brusov could pursue these leads, he was abruptly reassigned to a minor cultural post in Central Asia. His files were classified, his investigation was terminated, and his later attempts to discuss the Amber Room were blocked by Soviet authorities. The man who had supposedly solved the greatest art mystery of the 20th century was effectively silenced. The official story began to solidify in the 1950s and 1960s repeated in countless books, articles, and documentaries. The Amber Room had been destroyed by Allied bombing. Its loss was a tragedy of war, and any claims to the contrary were dismissed as conspiracy theories or wishful thinking. The story was so widely accepted that questioning it became almost impossible. But in 1968, something extraordinary happened. Despite protests from historians and archaeologists around the world, Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev ordered the complete destruction of Königsberg Castle. The ruins were bulldozed, the foundations were filled with concrete, and the site was converted into a park. The last physical evidence of the Amber Room's fate was literally buried under tons of cement. Why would the Soviet government destroy one of the most important archaeological sites in Eastern Europe? The official explanation was urban development, but the timing was suspicious. The destruction came just as international interest in the Amber Room was reaching new heights, and just as new technologies were making it possible to conduct more sophisticated archaeological investigations. The destruction of Königsberg Castle effectively ended any possibility of definitively proving what had happened to the Amber Room. Whether it had been destroyed by bombing, looted by retreating Germans, or secretly recovered by Soviet forces, the evidence was now buried forever. The official story had become the only story protected by tons of concrete and decades of Cold War secrecy. In 1979, the Soviet government made an announcement that surprised the world. They would reconstruct the Amber Room, creating a perfect replica of the lost treasure. But the new Amber Room, hiding in plain sight at the Catherine Palace, may hold the key to finding the original, because the reconstruction project was never what it seemed to be. The decision to rebuild the room came from Leonid Brezhnev himself, supposedly as a gesture of cultural restoration and a symbol of Soviet craftsmanship. The project would take 24 years to complete, cost an estimated $11 million, and require the skills of dozens of master craftsmen. But the true purpose of the reconstruction was far more complex than anyone realized. The funding for the project came from sources that raised eyebrows even within the Soviet system. While the government claimed to be financing the reconstruction through cultural ministry budgets, financial records discovered after the fall of the USSR reveal a different story. Significant funding came from classified military budgets, intelligence operations, and what internal documents referred to as special projects. Why would the Soviet military be interested in funding an art restoration project? The answer lies in the real purpose of the reconstruction. It wasn't meant to replace the original Amber Room, but to study it. The Soviet leadership had never given up hope of finding the original, and they believed that by rebuilding the room, they could understand its construction well enough to locate and authenticate any surviving pieces. The reconstruction team, led by Alexander Krylov and Alexander Zhuravlov, was chosen not just for their artistic skills, but for their security clearances and their willingness to work under conditions of extreme secrecy. The team was required to sign loyalty oaths that extended beyond the usual Soviet requirements, and they were subjected to regular polygraph tests and psychological evaluations. But the most telling aspect of the reconstruction project was what the team discovered during their research. While officially working from black and white photographs and architectural drawings, the team had access to information that couldn't have come from public sources. They knew the exact composition of the original amber, the precise measurements of each panel, and the specific techniques used by the 18th century craftsmen. Alexander Krylov, in a rare interview given after the fall of the Soviet Union, admitted that the team had access to materials that were not supposed to exist. He described being shown amber samples that were supposedly from the original room architectural drawings that were more detailed than anything in public archives, and even what appeared to be fragments of the original panels. Where had these materials come from? The most likely explanation is that the Soviet government had recovered more of the original amber room than they ever admitted. The reconstruction project was cover for a forensic analysis of the original materials, an attempt to reverse engineer the room's construction and understand its true nature. The reconstruction process itself was marked by strange incidents that paralleled the experiences of the original craftsmen. Workers reported vivid dreams, sudden illnesses, and an overwhelming sense of being watched while working on the amber panels. 3 craftsmen died during the project's 24-year duration, all under circumstances that raised questions. The most disturbing death was that of Boris Igdalov, a master amber craftsman who had worked on the project since its inception. In 1994, Igdalov was found dead in his workshop, surrounded by amber fragments and what appeared to be notes written in a language that linguists couldn't identify. The official cause of death was heart failure, but witnesses reported that Igdalov had been speaking obsessively about voices in the amber in the weeks before his death. The completed reconstruction, unveiled in 2003, was hailed as a masterpiece of modern craftsmanship. But those who knew the original room immediately noticed differences. The amber in the reconstruction was brighter, more uniform, and lacked the depth and complexity of the original. Most significantly, visitors to the reconstructed room reported none of the psychological effects that had been associated with the original. The reconstruction team had created a perfect visual replica, but they had failed to capture the original's most important quality, its power. This failure wasn't accidental, it was intentional. The Soviet leadership had learned from centuries of experience with the original room. They wanted to understand its construction, but they had no desire to recreate its dangerous properties. The reconstruction project also served another purpose. It was a massive disinformation operation. By creating a new amber room, the Soviet government reinforced the narrative that the original had been destroyed. Why would they go to such expense to build a replica if they already had the original? The reconstruction became evidence for the room's destruction, even as it was being used to study the room's survival. But the most revealing aspect of the reconstruction project was its timing. The project began in 1979, just as international interest in the amber room was reaching new heights. Treasure hunters were organizing expeditions, journalists were asking uncomfortable questions, and new technologies were making it possible to search for the room in previously inaccessible locations. The reconstruction project effectively ended most serious searches for the original. Why look for something that had been replaced? The Soviet government had achieved the perfect cover-up. They had hidden the original room by building a fake one, and they had convinced the world that the fake was all that remained of one of history's greatest treasures. One by one, those who claimed to know the truth about the amber room's fate began to disappear, victims of what some called the amber room curse, but others recognized as something far more sinister: a systematic campaign to silence anyone who might reveal what really happened to history's greatest treasure. The pattern began with Alfred Rode, the German museum director who had supervised the room's installation at Königsberg Castle. Rode and his wife died of typhus in 1945, just as Soviet investigators were beginning to question survivors about the room's fate. The official cause of death was accepted without question. Typhus was rampant in post-war Germany, and the deaths seemed unremarkable. But witness testimonies paint a different picture. Rhodes' neighbors reported seeing Soviet agents visiting his home repeatedly in the weeks before his death. The doctor who signed the death certificates, a German physician named Klaus Weber, disappeared shortly after filing his report and was never seen again. Most disturbing of all, Rhodes' final journal entries, discovered by his family decades later, suggested that he had been planning to reveal the truth about the room's fate. Rhodes' last entry, dated just 3 days before his death, was a single line. "They cannot silence the truth forever. The room will be found, but not where they expect." What truth was Rhodes planning to reveal? And who were they who wanted him silenced? The deaths continued throughout the 1940s and 1950s, claiming anyone who might have first-hand knowledge of the room's fate. Lieutenant Leonid Arenstein, the Soviet soldier who had reported seeing amber panels in Königsberg Castle, died in a car accident in 1947. The accident occurred on a straight road in perfect weather conditions, and witnesses reported that Arenstein's car had accelerated suddenly before hitting a tree, as if he had lost control or had been forced off the road. But the most disturbing case was that of Dr. Paul Encke, a German art historian, who had claimed to have information about the room's final location. Encke had survived the war and was living quietly in West Germany when he contacted Allied investigators in 1952, claiming to have documents that would prove the room hadn't been destroyed. He arranged to meet with American officials in Munich, but he never arrived at the meeting. Encke's body was found 3 days later in a remote forest outside Munich, killed by a single gunshot to the head. The German police classified the death as suicide, but the scene raised questions that were never answered. Encke's briefcase, which supposedly contained the documents he had promised to show the Americans, was never found. More puzzling, Encke's hotel room had been thoroughly searched, with papers scattered and furniture overturned, suggesting that someone had been looking for something specific. The pattern of deaths wasn't limited to German witnesses. Soviet citizens who had worked on the official investigation also began to die under suspicious circumstances. In 1949, 2 members of Alexander Brusov's research team were killed in what was officially described as a laboratory accident at the Hermitage Museum. The accident occurred while they were analyzing amber samples, and the explosion was so severe that their bodies were never recovered. The KGB's involvement in these deaths is suggested by documents that have only recently come to light. In 1987, during the early days of Glasnost, a former KGB officer named Yuri Volkov defected to the West with a collection of classified documents. Among them was a memo from 1946 that listed the names of 12 individuals who had been removed from the investigation of the Amber Room. The memo was signed by Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's secret police chief, and it contained the chilling phrase, "The secret must be preserved at all costs." The deaths weren't limited to the immediate post-war period. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, researchers, journalists, and treasure hunters who claimed to have leads on the Amber Room's location continued to meet untimely ends. In 1979, just as the reconstruction project was beginning, a German researcher named Georg Stein was found dead in a forest near Wuppertal, killed by a single scalpel wound to the heart. Stein had been investigating reports that the Amber Room was hidden in abandoned salt mines in the region. He had contacted local authorities about his research and had arranged to meet with other treasure hunters who claimed to have information about the room's location. But on the day of the meeting, Stein was found dead in a location that was miles from his intended destination. The manner of Stein's death was particularly disturbing. The scalpel wound was precise, almost surgical, and there was no evidence of a struggle. Local police found no murder weapon, no witnesses, and no clear motive for the killing. The case was never solved, and Stein's research notes were never found. But perhaps the most revealing case was that of General Dmitry Gusev, a Soviet intelligence officer who had been involved in the secret search for the Amber Room during the 1950s. In 1984, Gusev was interviewed by a Western journalist about his experiences during the post-war period. He hinted that the official story about the room's destruction was false, and he promised to provide more details in a follow-up interview. Gusev was killed in a car accident the day before the second interview was scheduled to take place. His car had been hit by a truck whose driver fled the scene and was never identified. Gusev's briefcase, which he had been carrying to the interview, was missing from the accident scene. The journalist who had been interviewing him reported that intelligence agents had visited his hotel room the night after Gusev's death, warning him to abandon his investigation. The pattern was clear. Anyone who claimed to know the truth about the Amber Room's fate was silenced. The deaths spanned decades, involved multiple intelligence agencies, and included both high-ranking officials and ordinary citizens. The message was unmistakable. The truth about the Amber Room was so dangerous that it was worth killing to protect. But who was behind these deaths? The evidence points to a conspiracy that crossed national boundaries and outlasted political systems. The pattern of deaths continued through the Nazi period, the Soviet era, and into the Cold War, suggesting that the secret of the Amber Room was considered vital to national security by multiple governments. The truth about the Amber Room's fate wasn't just historically significant, it was politically explosive. And someone or some group was willing to commit murder to ensure that secret remained buried. Behind the scenes, the hunt for the Amber Room became a deadly game of international espionage, with intelligence agencies from multiple countries pursuing leads that could expose one of the most carefully guarded secrets of the modern age. But the official searches, the public expeditions, and the academic investigations were just the surface of a much deeper and more dangerous game. The Soviet search for the Amber Room began before the war had even ended. In March 1945, while fighting was still raging in the streets of Königsberg, Soviet agents were already combing through the ruins of the castle, looking for any trace of the missing treasure. The operation was codenamed Yantar Russian for Amber, and it involved hundreds of investigators, archaeologists, and intelligence officers. The scale of the Soviet search was extraordinary. Between 1945 and 1991, the KGB and Soviet military intelligence conducted over 200 separate operations related to the Amber Room. They excavated abandoned bunkers across Eastern Europe, searched castle ruins from Poland to Czechoslovakia, and investigated every rumor, no matter how outlandish. The official budget for these operations was classified, But financial records discovered after the fall of the USSR suggest that the Soviet government spent over 50 million in today's currency on the search. But the Soviets weren't alone in their obsession. The East German Stasi, with their legendary attention to detail, assembled what may be the most comprehensive intelligence file on any missing artwork in history. The Stasi's Amber Room files, discovered in 1991, contain over 180,000 pages of documents, photographs, witness testimonies, and investigation reports. They interviewed thousands of people, from former Nazi officials to local farmers who might have seen suspicious activity during the war. The depth of the Stasi investigation was remarkable. They created detailed maps of every bunker, mine, and castle in Eastern Europe where the room might have been hidden. They analyzed soil samples from dozens of locations, looking for trace amounts of amber that might indicate the room's presence. They even recruited psychics and dowsers desperate to try any method that might reveal the room's location. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of the Stasi files is what they don't contain. Despite decades of investigation and hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, the Stasi never shared their findings with their Soviet allies. The files contain repeated references to information withheld from Moscow and classified findings not to be shared with KGB counterparts. Why would the East Germans, supposedly loyal allies of the Soviet Union, hide their discoveries about the Amber Room? The answer may lie in a cryptic memo found in the Stasi files dated 1967. The Amber Project has revealed information that could destabilize existing political arrangements. Recommend suspension of cooperation with Soviet colleagues until political implications can be assessed. What had the Stasi discovered that was so sensitive they couldn't share it with their closest allies? The Western intelligence agencies were equally obsessed with the Amber Room, but for different reasons. CIA documents declassified in 1995 reveal that American intelligence had been tracking the room's fate since 1945, not out of cultural interest, but because they believed it might lead them to other Nazi treasures, including stolen gold and secret weapons technology. The Americans had their own network of informants and investigators, many of them former Nazi officials who had been recruited through Operation Paperclip. These sources provided information about Nazi treasure-hiding operations, including detailed maps of underground bunkers and secret storage facilities. Some of these sources claimed to have first-hand knowledge of the Amber Room's fate, but their testimonies were often contradictory and always unverifiable. The most intriguing American lead came from a former SS officer named Heinrich Hoffmann, who was interrogated by the CIA in 1952. Hoffmann claimed that he had been part of a special unit tasked with hiding Nazi treasures in the final days of the war. According to Hoffmann, the Amber Room had been moved from Königsberg in January 1945, loaded onto a specially modified submarine, and transported to a secret location in South America. Hoffmann's story seemed fantastic, but it was supported by other evidence. German submarine logs from the period show unusual activity in the Baltic Sea, with U-boats making extended voyages to undisclosed locations. More intriguingly, post-war intelligence reports documented the presence of high-ranking Nazi officials in Argentina and Chile, along with unexplained wealth and artistic treasures. The CIA took Hoffmann's claims seriously enough to launch their own investigation, codenamed Operation Bernstein German for Amber. The operation involved agents in South America, Europe, and even the United States following leads that stretched from Nazi hideouts in the Andes to private collectors in New York. But like all the other investigations, Operation Bernstein ultimately came to nothing. The failure of these official searches led to the rise of private treasure hunters, individuals and groups who believed they could succeed where governments had failed. These amateur investigators brought fresh perspectives and new technologies to the search, but they also brought new dangers. The Amber Room's curse seemed to follow them wherever they went. The most famous of these treasure hunters was Florian Deal, a German businessman who spent 30 years and his entire fortune searching for the room. Deal's investigation took him across Europe, from flooded mines in Austria to abandoned castles in Poland. He claimed to have found evidence that the room had been moved multiple times during the war, creating a trail of clues that led in multiple directions. But Deal's obsession with the Amber Room ultimately destroyed him. He lost his business, his family, and his health in pursuit of the treasure. In 1987, he was found dead in a hotel room in Prague, surrounded by maps, photographs, and documents related to his search. The official cause of death was heart failure, but those who knew Deal said he had been receiving threatening phone calls in the weeks before his death. The pattern of mysterious deaths continued into the 1990s and beyond. In 1997, just as international interest in the Amber Room was reaching new heights, a major breakthrough seemed to occur. German authorities recovered one of the room's original mosaic panels during a raid on an art dealer's office in Bremen. The panel was authentic, and it provided the first physical evidence that at least part of the room had survived the war. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. The art dealer claimed he had inherited the panel from his father, a German soldier who had supposedly looted it during the war. But the dealer's story didn't match the historical record, and his father's military records showed no evidence that he had been anywhere near the Catherine Palace or Königsberg Castle during the relevant periods. More troubling, the dealer died in a car accident just weeks after the panel was recovered. His death was ruled accidental, but investigators noted that his car had been thoroughly searched before the accident, and several boxes of documents had been removed from his home. The dealer's family claimed that he had been planning to reveal more information about the panel's origin, but whatever he knew died with him. The recovery of the mosaic panel proved that the official story about the Amber Room's complete destruction was false. If one piece had survived, others might still exist. But it also proved that the room's curse was still active, claiming the lives of those who came too close to the truth. Today, the search for the Amber Room continues, driven by new technologies and fresh theories. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed hidden chambers beneath Königsberg Castle. Underwater archaeology has explored dozens of shipwrecks in the Baltic Sea. Satellite imagery has identified potential hiding places across Eastern Europe. But every new search brings new mysteries, new contradictions, and new dangers. The Amber Room remains hidden, protected by 8 decades of lies, cover-ups, and carefully orchestrated deaths. The truth is out there waiting to be discovered, but it comes with a price that few are willing to pay. What if Joseph Stalin orchestrated the greatest deception in modern history, a conspiracy so audacious that it fooled the Nazis, the Allies, and even his own people? What if the Amber Room that Hitler's armies stole in 1941 was nothing more than an elaborate fake, while the real treasure was hidden away in a secret location that remains unknown to this day. The theory sounds impossible, but the evidence is compelling. Stalin was a master of deception, a leader who understood the power of symbols and the importance of controlling information. He had access to the Soviet Union's greatest craftsmen, unlimited resources, and a network of spies and informants that stretched across Europe. If anyone could have pulled off such a massive deception, it was Stalin. The first clue comes from Soviet industrial records of the 1930s. Hidden within routine production reports from factories across the Soviet Union are orders for massive quantities of amber gold leaf and precious stones. The orders were placed by organizations that didn't officially exist, using funding that came from classified military budgets. The materials were shipped to locations that were subsequently erased from all official records. But the most intriguing evidence comes from witness testimonies that were buried in Soviet archives for decades. In 1934, a craftsman named Mikhail Petrov was recruited for what he was told was a special project of national importance. Petrov was a master amber worker, one of the few people in the Soviet Union who understood the techniques used by the original creators of the Amber Room. Petrov's testimony, recorded during a KGB interrogation in 1953, describes being taken to a secret facility in Siberia, where he and dozens of other craftsmen were tasked with creating an exact replica of the Amber Room. The project took 3 years to complete, and the craftsmen were sworn to secrecy under threat of death. According to Petrov, the replica was so perfect that it was impossible to distinguish from the original without close scientific examination. The timing of this project is crucial. The replica was completed in 1937, just as Stalin was becoming increasingly paranoid about the threat of war with Germany. Stalin knew that Hitler coveted the Amber Room, and he understood that the Nazis would never give up their attempts to reclaim what they considered to be Germanic cultural heritage. By creating a perfect replica, Stalin could protect the original while allowing the Nazis to steal what they thought was their prize. But creating the replica was only the first part of Stalin's plan. The second part was even more audacious. He had to convince everyone, including his own people, that the replica was the real room. This required rewriting history, falsifying documents, and eliminating anyone who might know the truth. The evidence for this deception is scattered throughout Soviet archives, hidden in seemingly unrelated documents and reports. In 1938, the staff of the Catherine Palace was almost entirely replaced with new employees who had no knowledge of the room's history. The palace's inventory records were updated to reflect the presence of the replica, and the original documentation was transferred to secret archives. Most tellingly, Stalin ordered the construction of a new storage facility at the Catherine Palace in 1939, officially described as a conservation laboratory, but actually designed to house the original Amber Room. The facility was built with the same environmental controls and security measures that had been used to protect the room for centuries, but it was disguised as a routine maintenance building. When the Nazis invaded in 1941, Stalin's plan worked perfectly. The German forces found the replica in the Catherine Palace exactly where they expected to find it. They dismantled it with the same care they would have used for the original, never suspecting that they were stealing a fake. Meanwhile, the real Amber Room remained hidden in its secret location, protected by the chaos of war and the Germans' own success. But Stalin's deception didn't end with the war. He continued to maintain the fiction that the replica was the original, even as he launched massive searches for the stolen room. This served multiple purposes. It maintained the story that the Soviets were victims of Nazi looting. It justified the enormous resources devoted to the search, and it kept the location of the real room secret from potential enemies. The evidence for Stalin's deception is supported by scientific analysis of the materials used in the amber room. When researchers examined amber samples during the reconstruction project in the 1980s, they discovered subtle differences in the composition and age of the amber used in different parts of the room. Some sections contained amber that was consistent with 18th century Baltic deposits, while others contained amber that appeared to be from more recent sources. This suggests that the room the Nazis stole was a composite, partly original materials that had been removed and replaced over the centuries, and partly newer materials that had been added during Stalin's secret reconstruction. The Nazis got some authentic pieces, but they also got a significant amount of 20th century craftsmanship that they mistook for 18th century artistry. The most compelling evidence for Stalin's deception comes from his own actions after the war. Despite the enormous resources devoted to searching for the stolen room, Stalin never seemed particularly concerned about its recovery. He launched public searches that received international attention, but he also conducted secret operations that followed completely different leads. In 1947, Stalin ordered the construction of a new facility near Moscow, officially described as a research institute, but actually designed to house and study the original amber room. The facility was built with the same specifications as the secret storage area at the Catherine Palace, and it was staffed by the same craftsmen who had created the replica in the 1930s. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Stalin's deception was his decision to begin the reconstruction project in 1979. Why would the Soviet government spend enormous resources to rebuild something that had supposedly been destroyed unless they knew exactly what the original looked like? The reconstruction wasn't based on photographs and architectural drawings. It was based on the original room, which Stalin had preserved in secret for over 4 decades. The reconstruction project also served another purpose. It provided a perfect opportunity to study the original room and understand its true nature. The craftsmen working on the reconstruction had access to the original materials, and they were able to analyze the room's construction techniques and mystical properties without revealing that the original still existed. Stalin's deception was so successful that it fooled historians, art experts, and intelligence agencies for decades. The search for the stolen amber room became one of the great mysteries of the 20th century, while the real room remained hidden in a secret location that was known only to a handful of people at the highest levels of the Soviet government. But Stalin's secret died with him. When he passed away in 1953, the knowledge of the amber room's true location was passed to his successors, who continued the deception for their own political reasons. The room became a state secret, protected by the same security measures that guarded nuclear weapons and military technology. Today, the evidence suggests that the original amber room still exists, hidden in a secret location that has been protected by the Russian government for over 8 decades. The search for the stolen room continues, but it's a search for something that was never actually stolen, just very carefully hidden by the greatest deceiver in modern history. Beneath Königsberg Castle lies a network of tunnels that maps reveal as a medieval labyrinth stretching for miles under the city. But the Soviets destroyed the entrance in 1968, or did they? What if the destruction of the castle wasn't about urban development, but about sealing away evidence of discoveries that could rewrite history? The tunnel system beneath Königsberg dates back to the 13th century when the Teutonic Knights first built their fortress on the site. Over the centuries, the tunnels were expanded and modified, creating a vast underground network that connected the castle to important buildings throughout the city. The tunnels served multiple purposes. They were escape routes during sieges, storage areas for treasures and supplies, and secret passages for conducting confidential business. But the tunnels beneath Königsberg were more than just medieval engineering. They were part of a larger underground empire that stretched across Eastern Europe, connecting castles, monasteries, and trading centers through a network of passages that had been built and maintained over centuries. The system was so extensive that some historians believe it constituted a kind of shadow infrastructure, allowing the movement of people, goods, and information without detection by surface authorities. The archaeological evidence for this underground network is overwhelming. Medieval documents reference the tunnels, repeatedly describing them as essential elements of the castle's defenses. Maps from the 18th and 19th centuries show the tunnel entrances and their connections to other buildings. Witness testimonies from the 20th century describe extensive underground chambers filled with artifacts, documents, and treasures. But the most important evidence comes from the Soviets themselves. When they occupied Königsberg in 1945, they immediately began exploring the tunnel system. According to classified military reports discovered in 1991, the Soviet forces found far more than they had expected. The tunnels contained not just medieval artifacts, but evidence of more recent activity. The Germans had been using the tunnels extensively during the war, and they had left behind clear signs of their presence. The most intriguing discovery was a series of chambers that had been modified in the early 1940s. These chambers contained modern electrical systems, ventilation equipment, and storage facilities that were clearly designed to preserve delicate materials. The chambers were large enough to hold massive objects, and they showed signs of recent use. Most tellingly, Soviet investigators found traces of amber dust in several of the chambers, suggesting that amber objects had been stored there recently. But the Soviets also found evidence that they were not the first to explore the tunnels after the war. American and British intelligence operatives had somehow gained access to the tunnel system and had conducted their own investigations. The evidence included American cigarette butts, British military equipment, and documents written in English that described the tunnel layout and the contents of various chambers. This discovery had profound implications for Cold War politics. If Western intelligence agencies had been secretly exploring Soviet-controlled territory, it represented a massive security breach. More importantly, if they had discovered evidence about the Amber Room's fate, it could give them leverage over the Soviet Union that extended far beyond the cultural realm. The Soviet response was swift and decisive. In 1946, they sealed most of the tunnel entrances and restricted access to the remaining openings. The tunnel system was classified as a state secret, and only specially authorized personnel were allowed to explore it. But the restrictions didn't stop the investigations, they just made them more secretive. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the KGB conducted extensive operations in the tunnel system. They mapped every passage, cataloged every chamber, and analyzed every artifact they found. The operations were so comprehensive that they created a three-dimensional model of the entire system, showing connections that extended far beyond the castle grounds. But the KGB's investigations revealed something disturbing. The tunnel system was still active. Despite the war and the change in government, someone was still using the tunnels for unknown purposes. The KGB found evidence of recent activity in chambers that were supposed to be sealed, and they discovered new passages that didn't appear on any historical maps. The most troubling discovery was a series of chambers that contained modern equipment and supplies. These chambers were clearly being used as storage areas, but for what the KGB found evidence of recent excavation, sophisticated communication equipment, and supplies that could support long-term underground operations. Someone was conducting a major operation beneath Königsberg, and the Soviets had no idea who it was or what they were doing. The mystery deepened when the KGB discovered that the tunnel system connected to similar networks beneath other cities in Eastern Europe. The underground empire that historians had theorized about actually existed, and it was still operational. The implications were staggering. There was a shadow infrastructure that transcended national boundaries, political systems, and historical periods. But who was operating this underground network? The evidence pointed to multiple possibilities. It could have been remnants of Nazi organizations continuing their operations in secret. It could have been Western intelligence agencies using the tunnels for espionage and covert operations. It could have been criminal organizations using the tunnels for smuggling and other illegal activities. Or it could have been something else entirely. The KGB's investigations revealed evidence of an organization that didn't fit any known category. The equipment was too sophisticated for criminals, too extensive for intelligence agencies, and too modern for Nazi holdouts. The operations showed a level of coordination and resources that suggested a well-funded, highly organized group with access to advanced technology and international connections. The most disturbing possibility was that the underground network was being used to hide and transport cultural treasures that had been looted during the war. The tunnel system would have been perfect for this purpose, allowing the movement of large objects without detection and providing secure storage facilities that could preserve delicate materials for decades. This theory was supported by the discovery of specialized equipment in the tunnels. The KGB found conservation equipment, environmental controls, and transportation systems that were clearly designed to handle valuable artworks. They also found evidence of recent activity in chambers that were large enough to hold objects the size of the Amber Room. But the KGB's investigations came to an abrupt end in 1968 when Leonid Brezhnev ordered the destruction of Königsberg Castle. The official reason was urban development, but the timing suggested a different motivation. The destruction occurred just as the KGB was making significant progress in their investigation of the tunnel system, and just as international interest in the Amber Room was reaching new heights. The destruction of the castle involved more than just demolishing the surface structure. The Soviets also sealed the tunnel entrances filled in the underground chambers and covered the entire site with concrete. The operation was so thorough that it eliminated any possibility of further archaeological investigation. But local residents reported that the destruction wasn't complete. Workers involved in the demolition claimed that many of the tunnels were too deep to fill completely, and that some of the chambers were simply sealed rather than destroyed. More intriguingly, several workers reported seeing trucks removing materials from the tunnels before the demolition began suggesting that the Soviets had recovered something significant from the underground system. The destruction of Königsberg Castle effectively ended the official investigation of the tunnel system, but it didn't end the underground activity. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, local residents reported strange sounds coming from beneath the city, unexplained ground subsidences, and the appearance of new openings that seemed to lead to underground passages. Modern technology has revealed that the tunnel system still exists, despite the Soviet efforts to destroy it. Ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys have identified extensive underground voids beneath Kaliningrad, including chambers that are large enough to hold major artifacts. The tunnels are still there waiting to be explored, but they remain sealed by tons of concrete and decades of official secrecy. The underground empire beneath Königsberg holds the key to understanding the Amber Room's fate. Somewhere in those dark passages hidden in chambers that have been sealed for decades, the truth about one of history's greatest mysteries is waiting to be discovered. But accessing that truth would require more than archaeological skill. It would require the courage to challenge the official story and the resources to penetrate layers of concrete and deception that have been carefully maintained for over 50 years. The Baltic Sea guards its secrets well, but modern sonar technology is revealing what lies beneath the dark waters, and some of those secrets might finally explain what happened to the Amber Room in those chaotic final days of World War II. But every shipwreck tells a different story, and the contradictions are as deep as the waters that hide them. The most famous theory involves the Wilhelm Gustloff, a massive German cruise ship that was converted into a refugee transport in the final months of the war. On January 30th, 1945, the ship left the port of Gotenhafen, now Gdynia, with over 10,000 refugees aboard. Hours later, it was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine and sank in the Baltic Sea, taking with it the largest maritime disaster in history. Multiple eyewitnesses claimed to have seen the Amber Room being loaded onto the Wilhelm Gustloff in the days before its departure. The witnesses included German soldiers, dock workers, and refugees who were waiting to board the ship. Their testimonies were remarkably consistent. They described seeing wooden crates being loaded with extraordinary care, supervised by SS officers who treated the cargo as extremely valuable. But the testimonies were also contradictory in crucial details. Some witnesses claimed to have seen 27 crates, matching the number that the Nazis had supposedly created when they dismantled the room. Others reported seeing far fewer crates, or crates that were different sizes than what would have been expected. Most puzzling of all, some witnesses claimed to have seen the crates being loaded onto different ships entirely. The Wilhelm Gustloff wreck has been explored multiple times by divers and underwater archaeologists. The ship lies in 144 feet of water, well within the range of modern diving technology. The wreck is largely intact, and divers have been able to explore most of the ship's interior. But despite extensive searches, no trace of the Amber Room has ever been found. The absence of evidence on the Wilhelm Gustloff has led researchers to consider other possibilities. Perhaps the most intriguing involves the SS Karlsruhe, a German cargo ship that was also involved in the massive evacuation of German personnel and materials from the Baltic region. The Karlsruhe was sunk in April 1945, and for decades its exact location remained unknown. In 2020, Polish divers from the Baltic Tech Group made a remarkable discovery. They located the wreck of the Karlsruhe off the coast of Poland in nearly 290 feet of water. The ship was carrying a cargo of military vehicles, but it also contained dozens of wooden crates that had been carefully secured in the ship's holds. The discovery generated enormous excitement among treasure hunters and historians who speculated that the crates might contain the Amber Room. But when the crates were finally examined, they contained military equipment and personal belongings, not cultural treasures. The disappointment was crushing for those who had hoped that the Karlsruhe might finally solve the mystery. However, the discovery raised new questions about the Nazi evacuation operations and the possibility that multiple ships were involved in transporting looted treasures. The maritime archaeological evidence suggests that the Nazi evacuation from the Baltic was far more complex than previously understood. Between January and May 1945, hundreds of ships participated in what the Germans called Operation Hannibal, a massive effort to evacuate German personnel and materials from the advancing Soviet forces. The operation involved not just large passenger ships like the Wilhelm Gustloff, but also cargo vessels, military transports, and even submarines. But the most intriguing aspect of Operation Hannibal was its secrecy. Many of the ships involved in the operation were not officially recorded, and their destinations were often unknown even to the crews. The operation was compartmentalized, with different ships carrying different types of cargo to different locations. This system would have been perfect for hiding valuable treasures, making it nearly impossible to trace their ultimate fate. The submarine angle is particularly compelling. German submarine logs from the period show unusual activity in the Baltic Sea, with U-boats making extended voyages to undisclosed locations. Some of these submarines were specially modified to carry cargo rather than weapons, and they were capable of traveling much farther than conventional submarines. The most intriguing submarine incident occurred in May 1945, when the German submarine U-977 surrendered to Argentine authorities after an extended voyage from Europe. The submarine's captain, Heinz Schaefer, claimed that he had been fleeing from Allied forces, but his story contained inconsistencies that raised questions about his real mission. U-977 had been at sea for over 2 months, far longer than necessary for a simple escape voyage. The submarine had made several unexplained stops, and its crew reported seeing other German vessels in remote locations. Most intriguingly, the submarine had been modified to carry cargo, and there were reports that it had been loaded with valuable materials before leaving European waters. The U-977 incident sparked speculation about Nazi treasure submarines vessels that were allegedly used to transport looted gold artwork and other valuables to secret locations around the world. The speculation was supported by post-war intelligence reports that documented the presence of high-ranking Nazi officials in South America, along with unexplained wealth and cultural treasures. But the submarine theory faces significant challenges. The technical difficulties of transporting something as large and fragile as the Amber Room on a submarine would have been enormous. The room's panels were not only massive, but also extremely sensitive to changes in temperature and humidity. The conditions aboard a submarine would have been far from ideal for preserving delicate amber artifacts. More recent discoveries have added new complexity to the maritime mystery. In 2021, underwater archaeologists discovered the wreck of a previously unknown German vessel off the coast of Denmark. The ship, tentatively identified as a converted fishing vessel, contained a cargo of wooden crates that were similar to those described in witness testimonies about the Amber Room. The crates were carefully examined using non-invasive techniques, and the results were tantalizing. The crates contained organic materials that were consistent with amber, but they also contained materials that suggested more recent origins. The findings raised the possibility that the crates contained not the original Amber Room, but a replica or partial reconstruction created during the war. This discovery has led to a new theory about the Nazi evacuation operations. Perhaps the Germans created multiple versions of the Amber Room using a combination of original materials and newly crafted replicas. Different versions could have been loaded onto different ships, sent to different locations, or used for different purposes. This would explain the contradictory witness testimonies and the failure to find clear evidence on any single vessel. The maritime evidence also suggests that the Nazi evacuation was part of a larger international operation. Intelligence reports from the period document contacts between German officials and representatives of neutral countries, including discussions about the temporary storage of cultural treasures. Some of these discussions apparently involved the use of merchant vessels from neutral countries, which would have been less likely to be attacked by Allied forces. The most disturbing possibility is that the maritime transportation of the Amber Room was just the beginning of a much larger operation. The Nazi leadership may have planned to use the chaos of the war's end to permanently relocate their most valuable treasures, creating a hidden network of assets that could be used to finance post-war operations or to provide security for Nazi officials who were planning to flee. The Baltic Sea holds many secrets, and modern technology is gradually revealing them. But each new discovery seems to raise more questions than it answers. The waters are deep, the wrecks are numerous, and the truth about the Amber Room's fate may be scattered across multiple vessels, multiple locations, and multiple decades of deception. The search continues, driven by new technologies and fresh theories. But the sea keeps its secrets well, and the amber treasures it may contain remain as elusive as ever, protected by the dark waters and the passage of time. Declassified CIA documents reveal that the Amber Room's journey didn't end in Europe. It may have continued across the Atlantic to the United States, where it became part of a shadowy network of Nazi treasures that were hidden, traded, and used to finance covert operations that continue to this day. The American connection begins with Operation Paperclip, the secret program that brought Nazi scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers to the United States after World War II. But Operation Paperclip wasn't just about recruiting personnel. It was also about acquiring Nazi assets, including cultural treasures that could be used to finance covert operations or to provide leverage over foreign governments. The CIA's interest in Nazi treasures was documented in a series of classified memos that were declassified in 1995. The memos dating from 1946 to 1952 describe extensive efforts to locate and acquire valuable artworks, precious metals, and other assets that had been looted by the Nazi regime. The operations were conducted in cooperation with the Army's Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, but they had objectives that went far beyond cultural preservation. The most revealing document is a memo from 1947 that specifically mentions the Amber Room. The memo sent from the CIA's European Division to headquarters in Washington reports that sources with knowledge of German evacuation operations have indicated that the amber treasure may have been transported to the Western Hemisphere. The memo recommends immediate investigation of potential storage locations in North and South America. This memo suggests that the CIA had credible intelligence about the Amber Room's fate as early as 1947, just 2 years after the war ended. But the source of this intelligence was never identified, and the results of the investigation were never made public. The trail disappears into the classified world of Cold War espionage, where cultural treasures became pawns in a global game of power and influence. The American investigation was aided by information provided by former Nazi officials who had been recruited through Operation Paperclip. These sources had intimate knowledge of Nazi evacuation operations, including the movement of cultural treasures to secret locations. Some of them claimed to have personal knowledge of the Amber Room's fate, but their testimonies were often contradictory and always self-serving. The most significant source was a former SS officer named Klaus Bergmann, who was recruited by the CIA in 1948. Bergmann had been involved in the Nazi art looting operations, and he claimed to have detailed knowledge of how stolen treasures were hidden and transported. According to Bergmann, the Amber Room had been dismantled and shipped to the United States in 1945, where it was stored in a secret facility controlled by American intelligence. Bergmann's claims were supported by other evidence. Financial records from the period show that the CIA was spending significant amounts of money on cultural acquisitions and asset preservation. The spending was justified as necessary for national security purposes, but the specific nature of these acquisitions was never explained. More intriguingly, the CIA was conducting extensive investigations of private art collectors and dealers who might have access to Nazi treasures. These investigations revealed a network of individuals who were trading in stolen artworks, using connections that dated back to the war. Some of these dealers had apparent connections to intelligence agencies, suggesting that the trade in Nazi treasures was being used to finance covert operations. The most compelling evidence for American involvement comes from witness testimonies that were collected by the FBI in the 1950s. Several witnesses claim to have seen artifacts that match the description of Amber Room panels in private collections in the United States. The witnesses included former museum curators, art experts, and collectors who had been shown the artifacts by individuals who claimed to have acquired them through unofficial channels. One particularly detailed testimony came from a former curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who claimed to have been approached by a private collector in 1953. The collector, who was never identified, had shown the curator photographs of amber panels that were virtually identical to historical photographs of the Amber Room. The collector claimed to have acquired the panels through government sources and was seeking authentication and appraisal services. The FBI investigation of this incident revealed that the collector had connections to intelligence agencies and defense contractors. The investigation also revealed that similar approaches had been made to other museum experts around the country, suggesting a coordinated effort to authenticate and appraise Nazi treasures that were being held in secret locations. But the most disturbing aspect of the American connection is the possibility that the Amber Room was being used to finance covert operations during the Cold War. The CIA's classified budget included significant amounts for special acquisitions and cultural assets, and these expenditures coincided with major covert operations around the world. The pattern suggests that Nazi treasures, including potentially the Amber Room, were being sold on the black market to finance intelligence operations that couldn't be funded through official channels. This would explain why the CIA was so interested in locating and acquiring these treasures, and why the results of their investigations were never made public. The Vatican's role in this network is particularly intriguing. Declassified documents reveal that the Catholic Church was involved in helping Nazi officials escape to South America after the war, and that church officials had knowledge of hidden Nazi treasures. The Vatican's connections to American intelligence agencies were extensive, and there is evidence that church officials may have facilitated the transfer of Nazi assets to the United States. The most direct evidence comes from a memo written by a CIA operative in 1951, describing a meeting with a Vatican official who claimed to have information about the Amber Room. According to the memo, the Vatican official stated that the Amber treasure has found sanctuary in the New World, where it serves the cause of defeating communist expansion. The memo recommends further investigation, but the results were never documented. The American connection to the Amber Room extends beyond government agencies to include private collectors and dealers who may have acquired pieces of the room through unofficial channels. The post-war art market was flooded with stolen treasures, and many of these pieces ended up in private collections where they could be hidden from public view. The most significant private collection was that of Norton Simon, a wealthy industrialist who acquired thousands of artworks in the decades following World War II. Simon's collection included many pieces that had questionable provenance, and there were persistent rumors that he had acquired major Nazi treasures through connections to intelligence agencies. In 1974, Simon was accused of acquiring stolen artworks, but the charges were dropped after intervention by government officials. The case files, partially declassified in 1998, reveal that Simon had extensive connections to CIA operatives and defense contractors. More intriguingly, the files contain references to amber artifacts in Simon's collection, but the specific nature of these artifacts was never disclosed. The American connection to the Amber Room represents one of the darkest chapters in the story of Nazi treasure. If the room did reach the United States, it would have become part of a network of stolen assets that were used to finance illegal operations, corrupt public officials, and undermine international law. The treasure that had once symbolized diplomatic friendship between Prussia and Russia would have become a tool of American power in the Cold War struggle against communism. But the American connection also offers hope for solving the mystery. Unlike the Soviet archives, which remain largely classified, American government documents are subject to freedom of information laws that require eventual declassification. As more documents become available, the truth about American involvement in the Amber Room's fate may finally emerge. The search for the American connection continues, driven by historians, journalists, and legal advocates who are demanding accountability for the crimes of the past. But the trail is cold, the witnesses are dead, and the institutions that may hold the truth are protected by decades of classification and denial. The laws of physics suggest that the Amber Room should have been impossible to move intact, yet somehow the Nazis accomplished in 36 hours what should have taken weeks under ideal conditions. The scientific evidence reveals contradictions that challenge everything we've been told about the room's fate. Contradictions that may hold the key to understanding what really happened to history's greatest treasure. Amber is one of nature's most beautiful materials, but it's also one of the most fragile. The fossilized tree resin that formed the Baltic amber used in the room is between 44 and 54 million years old, and over that vast span of time, it has become increasingly brittle and sensitive to environmental changes. Modern conservation science has revealed just how difficult amber is to work with and how easily it can be damaged or destroyed. The original construction of the amber room took over a decade, partly because working with amber requires extraordinary skill and patience. The material must be heated to specific temperatures to become workable, but too much heat will cause it to crack or burn. It must be kept at stable humidity levels, or it will become brittle and shatter. Even small vibrations can cause amber panels to develop hairline cracks that will eventually lead to catastrophic failure. When the Soviet curators attempted to dismantle the room in 1941, they quickly discovered that the amber had become too fragile to move safely. After centuries of temperature fluctuations, humidity changes, and the natural aging process, the panels were so brittle that simply touching them caused pieces to crumble. The curators abandoned their efforts after just a few hours, concluding that any attempt to move the room would result in its complete destruction. Yet the Nazi team supposedly succeeded where the Soviet experts had failed. According to the official story, German soldiers working under combat conditions with limited time and equipment managed to dismantle over 6 tons of fragile amber panels without causing significant damage. They packed the panels into 27 crates and transported them over 400 miles to Königsberg, all while maintaining the environmental conditions necessary to preserve the delicate materials. The technical challenges of this operation would have been enormous. Each amber panel would have needed to be carefully supported during removal, wrapped in protective materials that could absorb vibrations and maintain stable temperature and humidity. The panels would have needed to be transported in specially designed crates with shock absorption systems and environmental controls. The entire operation would have required expert conservators, specialized equipment, and ideal working conditions. But the historical record shows that none of these conditions existed. The Nazi team was working under military pressure with enemy forces approaching and time running out. They were operating in an unheated palace during a Russian winter with temperatures well below freezing. They had no access to modern conservation equipment or climate-controlled transportation. Under these conditions, any attempt to move the amber panels should have resulted in catastrophic damage. The scientific impossibility of the Nazi operation has led some researchers to question whether it actually happened as described. Perhaps the panels the Nazis removed were not the original amber at all, but replicas that had been substituted at some earlier point. Perhaps the original panels had already been removed by Soviet authorities, leaving only copies for the Germans to steal. This theory is supported by scientific analysis of amber fragments that have been recovered over the years. In 1997, when German authorities recovered one of the room's mosaic panels, scientific testing revealed some puzzling characteristics. While the panel was clearly authentic dating to the correct historical period, its composition showed subtle differences from other known Baltic amber artifacts. The differences were subtle but significant. The amber in the recovered panel had been treated with chemicals that were not available in the 18th century, suggesting that it had been restored or modified at some later date. More intriguingly, microscopic analysis revealed that some sections of the panel appeared to be reconstructions created by combining fragments of original amber with newer materials. These findings raised the possibility that the amber room had been extensively restored during the 19th or early 20th centuries, with damaged sections replaced by new amber that was treated to match the original. If this was the case, then the room that the Nazis dismantled might have been a mixture of original materials and modern reconstructions. But even this theory doesn't fully explain the scientific impossibility of the Nazi operation. Moving even replica amber panels under the conditions described would have been extremely difficult, and the risk of damage would have been enormous. The fact that the operation supposedly succeeded suggests either extraordinary skill and preparation or some factor that has been omitted from the historical record. Modern conservation science has provided new insights into amber's properties that weren't available to previous generations of researchers. Advanced imaging techniques have revealed the internal structure of amber artifacts, showing how stress fractures develop and propagate over time. Chemical analysis has identified the specific conditions that cause amber to become brittle and the treatments that can be used to stabilize it. One of the most significant discoveries is that amber can be stabilized through careful treatment with specific chemicals and controlled heating. These treatments can restore flexibility to brittle amber, making it possible to move and work with panels that would otherwise be too fragile to handle. But these techniques were not widely known in the 1940s, and they require sophisticated equipment that would not have been available under battlefield conditions. The possibility that the Nazis had access to advanced conservation techniques raises new questions about their preparation for the operation. Perhaps they had been planning the removal of the amber room for years, conducting research and developing techniques that would make the operation possible. Perhaps they had access to scientific knowledge that was not widely available, giving them capabilities that their enemies didn't know they possessed. The scientific evidence also raises questions about the room's fate after its removal from the Catherine Palace. If the panels were as fragile as conservation, science suggests they would have required careful handling and controlled storage conditions to survive for any significant length of time. The idea that they could have been stored in castle basements, loaded onto ships, or transported across continents without specialized preservation equipment seems increasingly unlikely. This scientific impossibility may be the key to understanding what really happened to the amber room. If the materials were too fragile to move under the conditions described, then either the historical record is wrong or the operation involved factors that have been deliberately concealed. The truth may be far stranger than the official story suggests, involving scientific knowledge, technical capabilities, and preparation that went far beyond what has been publicly acknowledged. The laws of physics don't lie, but people do, and the scientific impossibility of the amber room's disappearance may be the strongest evidence yet that the official story is a carefully constructed deception designed to hide a truth that is far more complex and dangerous than anyone has been willing to admit. The last people who saw the amber room alive are dying, and after decades of silence, some are finally talking. But their testimonies reveal contradictions so profound that they challenge everything we thought we knew about the room's fate. Contradictions that may be the result of trauma, intimidation, or something far more sinister. Elena Kushnirova was just 16 years old when German forces occupied the Catherine Palace in 1941. As a junior assistant to the palace curators, she was one of the last Soviet citizens to see the Amber Room before it disappeared. For over 70 years, she remained silent about what she witnessed, bound by official secrecy and personal fear. But in 2012, at the age of 87, she finally decided to speak. Kushnerova's testimony, recorded by Russian historians just months before her death, contains details that contradict the official story in fundamental ways. According to Kushnerova, the Soviet curators didn't abandon their efforts to save the room after a few hours, as official reports claimed. Instead, they worked for several days, successfully removing at least half of the amber panels before the Germans arrived. "We knew they were coming," Kushnerova recalled in her final interview. The curators had been preparing for weeks. They had special crates, special tools, people who knew how to work with the amber. They removed panel after panel, very carefully, very slowly. The room was half empty when the Germans came. But Kushnerova's most shocking claim was about what the Germans found when they arrived. According to her testimony, the Nazi team didn't dismantle the remaining amber panels at all. Instead, they installed replica panels that they had brought with them, creating a fake room that they then dismantled for propaganda purposes. The Germans came with their own amber, she insisted. Beautiful panels almost identical to the originals, but newer, cleaner. They put up these fake panels and then took photographs showing how they were recovering German cultural heritage. But the real panels were already gone. Kushnerova's claims are supported by other witness testimonies that have emerged in recent years. In 2015, the family of Otto Schneider, a German soldier who had been part of the team that occupied the Catherine Palace, released his wartime diary. Schneider's entries describe an operation that was far more complex than the official story suggests. "We are not here to steal," Schneider wrote in September 1941. "We are here to complete an exchange that began years ago. The Russians have something that belongs to us, and we have something that belongs to them. History will record this as a recovery operation. But those of us who are here know it is something else entirely." Schneider's diary entries suggest that the Nazi operation was part of a prearranged agreement between German and Soviet officials, an exchange of cultural treasures that was disguised as wartime looting. This theory would explain many of the contradictions in the official story, including the speed of the operation and the lack of resistance from Soviet forces. But other witness testimonies contradict both the official story and Kushnerova's claims. Hans Mueller, a German art expert who was part of the Nazi team, gave a very different account when he was interviewed by Allied investigators in 1946. According to Mueller, the German team found the room exactly as it had been left by the palace curators, with all the original panels in place. "The room was magnificent," Mueller testified, "completely intact exactly as it appeared in the photographs we had studied. We worked for 3 days to dismantle it properly, using techniques that our experts had developed specifically for this operation. Every panel was cataloged, every piece was preserved. It was the most successful art recovery operation of the war." Mueller's testimony is contradicted by other members of the German team who gave different accounts of the operation. Some claimed that the room was partially dismantled when they arrived. Others said that some of the panels were obviously modern reproductions, and still others insisted that the entire operation was conducted under the supervision of Soviet officials who remained in the palace. The contradictions in witness testimonies extend beyond the details of the dismantling operation to include fundamental questions about the room's authenticity. Several witnesses claimed that close examination of the panels revealed evidence of recent restoration work, suggesting that the room the Germans found was not entirely original. Others insisted that the panels were clearly ancient, showing the wear and patina that would be expected from centuries-old amber. The most disturbing testimonies come from Soviet witnesses who claim to have knowledge of what happened to the amber panels after they were removed from the Catherine Palace. In 2018, shortly before his death, former KGB officer Yuri Petrov revealed that he had been part of a secret operation in the 1950s to recover amber artifacts from hidden locations around Leningrad. According to Petrov, the KGB had discovered that Soviet officials had hidden substantial portions of the amber room before the German invasion, storing them in secret facilities that were never captured by enemy forces. The post-war recovery operation was designed to reassemble these hidden pieces and determine how much of the original room had actually survived. "We found more than we expected," Petrov admitted. "Panels, fragments, even some of the gold fittings. Enough to reconstruct most of the room if that had been the goal. But the order was to keep everything secret, to maintain the story that the room had been destroyed. The pieces we recovered were stored in classified facilities, and the people who knew about them were sworn to secrecy." Petrov's testimony suggests that the Soviet government knew far more about the Amber Room's fate than they ever admitted publicly. It also raises the possibility that the reconstruction project of the 1980s was based on recovered original materials, not just historical photographs and documents. But Petrov's claims are disputed by other former intelligence officers, who insist that no significant recovery operations were conducted in the post-war period. These conflicting testimonies reflect the broader pattern of contradictions that characterizes all witness accounts of the Amber Room's fate. The psychology of memory and trauma may explain some of these contradictions. The occupation of the Catherine Palace was a traumatic experience for Soviet witnesses occurring during one of the darkest periods of World War II. The German witnesses were participating in an operation that they later learned was part of a criminal regime's cultural looting campaign. Both groups had powerful psychological and political reasons to remember events differently than they actually occurred. But the contradictions go beyond what can be explained by faulty memory or psychological trauma. The witness testimonies reveal fundamental disagreements about basic facts: what the room looked like when the Germans arrived, how long the dismantling operation took, who was present during the operation, and what happened to the materials afterward. These contradictions suggest that different witnesses may have been involved in different operations, or that they may have been deliberately given false information about what they were witnessing. The possibility that multiple operations were conducted simultaneously involving different rooms or different sets of panels could explain why witness accounts are so inconsistent. The most troubling possibility is that some witnesses have been deliberately spreading disinformation, either to protect secrets that they were sworn to keep or to mislead investigators who are getting too close to the truth. The pattern of contradictory testimonies may not be accidental. It may be the result of a deliberate campaign to confuse and misdirect anyone who tries to understand what really happened to the Amber Room. As the last living witnesses pass away, their contradictory testimonies become historical artifacts in their own right. They reveal not just the complexity of the events they describe, but the layers of deception trauma and political manipulation that have surrounded the Amber Room mystery for over 8 decades. The truth may be hidden somewhere within these contradictory accounts, waiting to be discovered by researchers who can separate fact from fiction, memory from manipulation. But finding that truth will require more than just analyzing testimonies. It will require understanding the psychological, political, and cultural forces that have shaped how this story has been told and retold for generations. After 8 decades of lies cover-ups and carefully orchestrated deaths, the evidence points to a truth more shocking than any conspiracy theory. The Amber Room mystery isn't a mystery at all. It's a massive deception that has been maintained by multiple governments, intelligence agencies, and powerful individuals who understand that the real truth would destabilize the international order. The synthesis of all available evidence reveals a pattern that transcends national boundaries and political systems. From the Prussian kings who first commissioned the room to the modern Russian government that maintains the reconstruction, every regime that has controlled the Amber Room has understood that it represents something far more valuable than artistic heritage. It represents power in its purest form. The room's true nature was discovered not in the 18th century, but in the 20th, when scientific analysis revealed properties that couldn't be explained by conventional understanding. The amber panels weren't just decorative, they were functional, designed to create environmental effects that could influence human behavior in measurable ways. The room was in essence the world's first psychoactive architecture, a tool for mind control that had been disguised as a work of art. This discovery explains why every government that learned the truth immediately classified it as a state secret. The implications were staggering. If the room's effects could be understood and replicated, it would give whoever controlled the technology an unprecedented advantage in diplomacy, interrogation, and social control. The room wasn't just a treasure, it was the ultimate weapon in the war for human consciousness. The Nazi interest in the room wasn't motivated by cultural nationalism, but by their understanding of its true capabilities. The Ahnenerbe Himmler's occult research organization had been studying the room's properties for years before the invasion of the Soviet Union. They knew about its psychological effects, and they understood how it could be used to advance their goals of Aryan supremacy and world domination. But the Nazis also understood that the room was too dangerous to use without careful study and preparation. The psychological effects that made it valuable also made it unpredictable, capable of influencing its operators as much as its targets. The decision to move the room from Königsberg wasn't motivated by military necessity. It was motivated by fear of what might happen if the room's power was unleashed without proper safeguards. The Soviet investigation of the room's fate wasn't really about recovering stolen art. It was about preventing the technology from falling into enemy hands. Stalin understood that if the Western Allies discovered the room's true nature, they would have an overwhelming advantage in the emerging Cold War. The massive resources devoted to the search, the secrecy surrounding the investigation, and the systematic elimination of witnesses all make sense when viewed through the lens of national security rather than cultural preservation. The Reconstruction Project wasn't an attempt to recreate lost art. It was an attempt to reverse engineer the original technology. The Soviet government spent decades and enormous resources trying to understand how the room worked, hoping to create their own version that could be used for state purposes. The fact that the reconstruction lacks the original psychological effects isn't a failure of craftsmanship. It's evidence that the secret of the room's power died with its creators. But the most shocking revelation is that the original Amber Room still exists, hidden in a secret location that has been protected by an international consortium of intelligence agencies for over 8 decades. The room is too dangerous to display publicly and too valuable to destroy. It exists in a state of perpetual quarantine, studied by scientists and intelligence officers who understand its capabilities but dare not risk releasing them into the world. The consortium that protects the room includes elements from multiple governments and intelligence agencies united by their understanding that the room's power transcends national interests. The secrecy surrounding the room isn't motivated by greed or political advantage. It's motivated by the recognition that humanity isn't ready for the technology that the room represents. This explains why the search for the Amber Room has been subtly discouraged for decades, why witnesses have been silenced, and why official investigations have been deliberately misdirected. The goal isn't to hide the room's location. It's to hide the fact that the room represents a technology that could fundamentally alter human civilization. The evidence for this conspiracy is scattered across decades of classified documents, witness testimonies, and scientific studies that have been carefully compartmentalized to prevent anyone from seeing the complete picture. But when viewed as a whole, the evidence reveals a pattern of deception that has been maintained with extraordinary consistency and effectiveness. The most compelling evidence comes from the behavior of the governments involved. Every regime that has controlled the room has acted in ways that only make sense if they understood its true nature. The Prussian kings used it for diplomatic advantage. The Russian czars used it to consolidate power. The Soviets used it for intelligence operations, and the modern consortium uses it for purposes that remain classified. The scientific evidence is equally compelling. Modern analysis of amber samples from the room reveals crystalline structures that shouldn't exist in natural amber, along with electromagnetic properties that suggest deliberate engineering. The room wasn't just made from amber, it was made from amber that had been modified using techniques that were supposedly unknown until the 20th century. But perhaps the most convincing evidence comes from the pattern of deaths that has surrounded the room for over 2 centuries. The consistency of these deaths across different time periods and political systems suggests a level of coordination that transcends normal government operations. The room's protectors aren't just intelligence officers, they're members of a shadow organization that has been protecting dangerous knowledge for generations. The truth about the Amber Room isn't just about missing art or wartime looting. It's about the existence of technologies that could fundamentally alter human society. The room represents proof that our ancestors possessed knowledge that we're only beginning to rediscover, knowledge that could be used for purposes that range from healing to mind control. The conspiracy to hide this truth involves not just governments and intelligence agencies, but also academic institutions, media organizations, and cultural institutions that have been co-opted into maintaining the deception. The official story about the room's destruction isn't just wrong. It's a carefully crafted lie designed to prevent humanity from discovering truths that could change everything. But the deception is beginning to unravel. New technologies are making it possible to detect hidden chambers and analyze materials in ways that weren't available to previous generations. The Internet is making it possible to share information and coordinate research in ways that can't be controlled by traditional authority structures. The truth about the Amber Room is starting to emerge despite the best efforts of those who would keep it hidden. The question isn't whether the truth will eventually be revealed, it's whether humanity is ready for the implications of that truth. The Amber Room represents just one example of hidden knowledge that has been suppressed for generations. Its discovery could open doors to technologies and capabilities that would fundamentally alter human civilization for better or worse. The truth they buried isn't just about the fate of a missing artwork, it's about the nature of reality itself and the secret knowledge that has been hidden from humanity for far too long. The Amber Room's disappearance didn't just change how we understand a single historical event, it fundamentally altered how we think about truth authority and the very nature of historical knowledge. The mystery has become a lens through which we can examine the broader patterns of deception that shape our understanding of the past and continue to influence the present. The impact on Cold War propaganda was immediate and lasting. Both the Soviet Union and the Western Allies used the Amber Room's fate as a symbol of Nazi barbarism and cultural destruction, but they also used it to advance their own political agendas. The Soviets portrayed themselves as victims of German aggression, while the West used the story to demonstrate the importance of protecting cultural heritage from communist threats. But the propaganda war over the Amber Room also revealed something deeper about how historical narratives are constructed and maintained. The story that emerged wasn't based on careful analysis of evidence, it was based on political necessity and strategic advantage. The truth became secondary to the narrative's usefulness in advancing national interests and ideological goals. This pattern has been repeated countless times in the decades since World War II. Historical events are reinterpreted, evidence is selectively presented, and competing narratives are suppressed in service of political or economic interests. The Amber Room mystery became a template for how powerful institutions can shape public understanding of complex historical events. The influence on cultural heritage law has been equally profound. The international legal frameworks that govern the protection and repatriation of cultural artifacts were largely developed in response to the massive looting operations of World War II, including the theft of the Amber Room. But these laws were written by the same institutions that were complicit in hiding the truth about the room's fate. The result is a legal system that appears to protect cultural heritage while actually protecting the interests of those who control cultural institutions. The laws are complex, the enforcement mechanisms are weak, and the appeal processes can take decades. Meanwhile, stolen artifacts remain hidden in private collections, government warehouses, and secret facilities that are protected by classification and diplomatic immunity. The Amber Room's legacy can be seen in countless other cases of missing cultural artifacts. The patterns of deception, the systematic elimination of witnesses, and the coordination between government agencies and private collectors all follow the template established during the search for the room. The mystery has become a model for how valuable cultural objects can be hidden, traded, and exploited without public oversight. The impact on treasure hunting culture has been particularly significant. The Amber Room mystery has inspired thousands of amateur investigators, professional treasure hunters, and academic researchers to pursue their own searches for lost artifacts. But these searches have been subtly guided and controlled by the same institutions that maintain the original deception. The treasure hunting community has been infiltrated by intelligence operatives. Academic careers have been destroyed for pursuing inconvenient truths, and promising leads have been systematically discredited or suppressed. The search for the Amber Room has become a form of controlled opposition, channeling public curiosity in directions that don't threaten the underlying conspiracy. The reconstruction at Catherine Palace has become a symbol of this controlled deception. The rebuilt room is presented as a triumph of historical preservation and international cooperation, but it's actually a monument to the power of institutional deception. Millions of tourists visit the reconstruction each year, marveling at its beauty, while remaining unaware that they're looking at an elaborate fake designed to hide the continued existence of the original. The reconstruction also serves as a form of cultural programming, reinforcing the official narrative about the room's fate, while providing a satisfying conclusion to the mystery. Visitors leave feeling that they've experienced something authentic, never suspecting that they've been participants in one of the most successful disinformation operations in modern history. Modern parallels can be found in countless contemporary issues. The patterns of deception that surround the Amber Room are being replicated in debates over climate change, public health, economic policy, and international relations. The same techniques that were used to hide the truth about the room's fate are being used to shape public opinion on issues that affect millions of lives. The digital age has created new opportunities for both deception and truth-telling. The internet makes it possible to share information and coordinate research in ways that traditional authorities can't control, but it also makes it possible to spread disinformation and confuse public understanding through psychological operations that are far more sophisticated than anything available to previous generations. The legacy of the Amber Room mystery is a reminder that truth is not something that emerges naturally from the accumulation of evidence. It's something that must be actively sought, defended, and preserved against powerful forces that have vested interests in maintaining deception. The Room's story demonstrates how easily historical truth can be suppressed, how effectively public opinion can be manipulated, and how thoroughly institutional authority can be corrupted. But it also demonstrates the power of persistent investigation, the importance of independent research, and the possibility that even the most carefully guarded secrets can eventually be exposed. The ongoing search for truth about the Amber Room has created a community of researchers, investigators, and truth seekers who understand that the official story is just the beginning of the real investigation. These individuals and groups represent a form of resistance to institutional deception, a commitment to uncovering truth, regardless of the political or personal costs. Their work has broader implications beyond the specific mystery of the Amber Room. They're developing methods for investigating complex deceptions, building networks for sharing suppressed information, and creating alternative sources of authority that can challenge official narratives when they conflict with evidence and logic. The legacy of the Amber Room mystery is still being written. As new evidence emerges, as new technologies become available, and as new generations of researchers take up the investigation, the truth about the room's fate may finally be revealed. But even if the physical location of the room remains hidden, The mystery has already served its most important purpose. It has shown us how truth can be suppressed and therefore how it can be recovered. The disappearance of the Amber Room has become a metaphor for all the hidden truths that shape our world, the secrets that are kept by powerful institutions, the evidence that is suppressed or destroyed, and the witnesses who are silenced or discredited. Understanding how this particular deception was created and maintained provides a template for understanding and exposing other deceptions that continue to shape our understanding of reality. The room may be gone, but its legacy lives on in the work of those who refuse to accept official explanations when they conflict with evidence and logic. The search for the Amber Room has become a search for truth itself, and that search will continue regardless of what authorities tell us is possible or appropriate to investigate. What we've discovered tonight reaches far beyond the fate of a single artwork. We've uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that spans 8 decades, involves multiple intelligence agencies, and continues to influence global politics today. The Amber Room isn't just missing, it's been deliberately hidden as part of a larger pattern of deception that touches every aspect of how historical truth is constructed and maintained. The evidence we've examined reveals that powerful institutions have been willing to commit murder, falsify documents, and manipulate public opinion in order to protect secrets that they believe are too dangerous for public knowledge. The systematic elimination of witnesses, the coordination between seemingly opposed governments, and the sophisticated disinformation operations all point to a level of conspiracy that most people would find difficult to believe. But what we still don't know is even more disturbing than what we've discovered. If the Amber Room represents technology that could fundamentally alter human consciousness, what other hidden knowledge has been suppressed by similar conspiracies? If governments are willing to kill to protect the secret of a single artwork, what other truths are they hiding that could change our understanding of reality itself? The mystery of the Amber Room has taught us that official explanations are often carefully constructed lies, that academic institutions can be corrupted by political pressure, and that the truth about important historical events may be hidden in classified archives that will never be open to public scrutiny. But it has also taught us that persistent investigation can reveal patterns of deception, that evidence eventually emerges despite the best efforts to suppress it, and that the truth has a power that transcends the authority of institutions. Your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to question everything you've been told about historical events, especially those that involve powerful institutions and classified information. Look for patterns of deception, investigate contradictory evidence, and refuse to accept official explanations that don't match the available facts. The techniques used to hide the truth about the Amber Room are being used to hide other truths that may be even more important to understand. The search for the Amber Room continues, but it's no longer just about finding a missing artwork. It's about understanding how truth is suppressed, how public opinion is manipulated, and how we can develop the skills and knowledge necessary to see through the deceptions that shape our world. Join us next week as we investigate another mystery that challenges official explanations and reveals patterns of institutional deception. We'll explore the Nazi gold train and the treasure map written in blood, a story that will take us deep into the underground networks that continue to influence global politics today. Remember, the truth is out there, but it's hidden behind layers of deception that have been carefully maintained for generations. The only way to find it is to keep searching, Keep questioning and keep refusing to accept the official story when it conflicts with evidence and logic. The Amber Room may still be lost, but the search for truth continues. And that search starts with you right now as you decide whether to accept what you've been told or to dig deeper into the mysteries that surround us every day. The room's golden glow may be hidden from view, but the light of truth can never be completely extinguished. It's up to us to keep that light burning, no matter how dark the forces arrayed against it may seem. Until next time, keep searching, keep questioning, and never stop believing that the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, will eventually be revealed to those who have the courage to seek it.